Welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. My name's Phil Topham, Executive Director of the FIEC. It's time for our regular dive into the news, and with me to do that in our new accommodation. Oh, no reaction. There we are. Sorry for a walk.
We're very close to one another.
Yeah, there we are. So we've got Adrian Reynolds.
Our knees are literally knocking together under the table.
Adrian Reynolds, our Head of National Ministries. Hello, Adrian. And
Hello.
John Stevens, our National Director. Hello.
Phil.
What do you think of it?
Well, it's closer to my office. I don't have to climb the stairs anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, yeah.
Basically, for those of you who are not watching, we're in a different place. We've moved offices for the podcast, and this will be our new home.
Why have we moved office, Phil?
Well, because we are renting out the space downstairs to a partner organisation, which is European Mission Fellowship. That's right, isn't it? So,
Yeah, we're delighted that their director, Scott Moore, moved to Market Harborough, and this just became a sensible base for them. We've always wanted the office to be able to be used more widely. We're glad that they can come in and use that, and it's an encouragement to hear about how the work of the gospel is growing across Europe.
Absolutely. Can we get some pot plants or something, Joel? What do you think? Just to brighten it up a little bit. Yeah, we're getting nods.
Where are the pot plants?
Yeah, I just feel like there should be a pot plant behind your head there, Adrian. Anyway, there we are.
It is work in progress. So if you're watching and we're all shadowy,
yeah, sorry about that. We're basically
going to come out of the shadows at some point.
If you're listening to this, you're thinking, stop talking about the aesthetic. I can't see anything. So here we are. Let's move on. A couple of things just to update on from an FIEC perspective. So bookings are still open for the next 10 days or so for the Leaders Conference.
Just about, yes. Few spaces left. We'd love to see you. It's full steam ahead here. The team are working really, really hard to put on a super conference. And just going through all the different sessions, I've been going through all the different seminars and looking at them all. I always say, if I want to go to a seminar, I think that's a good sign. And I literally want to go to every seminar.
I would second that.
Some really good content coming up.
I was reading through the brochure ahead of print, and I was feeling exactly the same. There's some great stuff that was being put on this year, so looking forward to that.
I think that's what we're saying is a lot of it will be available afterwards to watch or catch up on, but there's nothing like actually being there. And it's the engagement with other people, over 1,000 people who are leading in FIEC churches, and that sense of togetherness, the opportunity to renew friendships, to form new relationships, to develop genuine partnerships with one another. So you can benefit from some of the talks afterwards, but actually the real value is of the being together.
Absolutely.
And building those relationships.
And I want to give a plug to something that I'm involved in after the Leaders Conference. So on Tuesday, the 19th of November, we're hosting a partnership day here with Medhurst Ministries. So Medhurst help churches
here, as in not Blackpool.
Here as in Market Harborough. So Medhurst help churches, as they describe, in forgotten places. So really on difficult housing estates, ex-local authority estates, those kind of what would be called schemes in Scotland. Basically, they do that work for churches in England. So on the 19th, we're hosting a day with Medhurst, and some of the Medhurst guys will be here, Ian Williamson and others. They'll be talking about what partnership looks like across contexts. And if you're listening to this and you're in a church in a more affluent area and you'd love to develop partnerships with churches in places where Medhurst serves, then please do come along. It'd be great to introduce you.
So it's not just
to
for
the
people
Medhurst
who
team.
are in that context.
It actually isn't for people in that context.
Okay.
So Medhurst will present on their behalf, but actually we really want folk to come along who are serving in more affluent communities to see if partnerships can be built, not just monetary ones either. So we published a story this week, we'll put in the show notes, about a partnership that's developed between Elmstead Baptist Church, leafy suburb of London, and Cleator Moor, Church on the Moor in Cleator Moor in Cumbria, which is a tough part of Cumbria. So it's a hugely encouraging story. Have a read of that. Those are the kind of partnerships we're talking about. So 19th of November, get it in your diary. Good. I did a good plug there, didn't I? Excellent.
Yes, yeah.
Plug from
Top
the
of
host.
the class, Phil.
Very good. So a couple of news stories that we want to talk about in more depth, but let's just update on a couple of things that are still going on in the news. A huge development yesterday in the Middle East. So the man who orchestrated the terrible atrocities on the 7th of October in Israel, Israel say they've killed him. And
yes, Yahya Sinwar, and not just those atrocities. It's worth noting that he was in prison for a long time for murdering Israeli hostages before, and in fact Palestinians. He's quite indiscriminate, quite an evil. It's obvious, I think, an evil man. But yes, the perpetrator of the terrible attacks last year, and yes, he's been killed. I think that seems fairly clear, and quite what will happen as a result of that, it's difficult, too early to say. And it's very difficult to judge these things from a distance. What difference will it make? Well, was he so much of a figurehead that will mortally wound Hamas? Will someone else rise up? Those questions are very difficult to answer, but it does feel like it's a significant moment, and we're just watching to see what will happen next.
Another story that is still going on that we've touched on before is the bill coming before Parliament for assisted dying. Worth saying that this is something Christians can take action now, can't they, in terms of writing to MPs? It's a free vote, which means you can ask your MP how they're going to vote, and they're not going to be whipped by the parties in this vote. Long way to go yet, but that was launched in Parliament this week, John.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very significant. It's a very different group in Parliament than voted the last time. There seems to have been a significant shift in public opinion on this issue. A survey of every constituency in the country suggested that the population supports the introduction of some kind of assisted dying. So at one level, there seems to have been a significant change in public attitude. So I think it seems more likely that this could pass through Parliament. In the past, MPs have been very concerned about the potential slippery slope argument about people being under pressure to die.
That's still strong, though.
I think it's still a very strong argument. And quite interesting, across the political spectrum, actually in the papers, irrespective of their political position, they're carrying articles from both sides of the debate. It's clear that there is a significant sort of disagreement between people who actually have common political views as to whether or not this would be a compassionate thing to do or whether this would be a dangerous thing to do. So yes, I think this is a moment of opportunity for Christians to be able to speak. As we do that and as we approach our MPs, let's try to speak well and clearly. Again, we were advised, we had a meeting with sort of James Mildred from Care recently. He was just reminding us with our relationships with MPs, we want to build positive relationships where we sort of commend them for good things, but also bring things to their attention. But here's an opportunity to engage with your local MP. And I think there's an inevitability that at a human level, in the political sphere, we have to engage with pragmatic arguments because those are what will be persuasive. We mustn't forget at the same time that theologically, actually for us, this is a very significant issue about legitimating of killing. So
that's quite a hard thing, though, isn't it? Because we're basically making one argument in the public square and another argument at home church.
I think at one level we do that on a whole load of issues because we have to engage with a secular public that doesn't necessarily hold to our views. That's no different from Paul, for example, making arguments with the Roman authorities about religious freedom for the church to be able to continue to meet. He is prepared to rely on his citizenship. He's prepared to make arguments about the legitimacy of worship under Roman law. And I think that actually is the difference between what you might call gospel proclamation and, on the other hand, what is basically about engagement to seek to protect people more widely in society. I mean, the same is true in relation to abortion. We can make a theological case that life begins at conception, but at one level, that's not necessarily going to be sort of a starting point that the secular world buys into. So I think this recognition that we no longer live in a Christian society and our Christian arguments aren't automatically accepted and regarded as valid or even willing to be heard, that does just remind us we have to engage in a slightly different way.
It's worth saying that in terms of what's happening in the Middle East and assisted dying, there are other things we've talked about in that context. There are other resources we can put in the show notes if you want to hear more on either of those things that we've done previously. But we just wanted to give an update on those. We've not forgotten about them. We know how significant they are.
Just with your MP, I also take advantage of constituency sort of gatherings where the MP is available, where you can go and visit them. So many MPs are available to meet their constituents. Meeting in person at one level just gives you an opportunity to build a relationship and speak with them about an issue. I met with my MP and we talked about this, and he was very responsive to the arguments.
Excellent. Right, let's move to talk about evangelism, which is a great thing to talk about. There's been the Evangelism Conference this last couple of weeks, took place in Scotland this time last week, then in London this past Wednesday. Adrian, you were in Scotland. John, you were in London. Let's just talk about some of the stories we were hearing about how the gospel is making progress.
Well, I think I certainly heard exactly the same thing we've said on many occasions, which is that churches are growing, churches are seeing conversions, but in greater numbers than I think they have for a long time, or perhaps ever in living memory. Now, we want to be cautious. This isn't revival, but there is a response to the gospel. And what is unexpected about it is it's often coming from people just turning up at church.
Yeah.
So it's not just people being contacted through events, though that's still going on. It's not just people being contacted through some of the regular means that the church would use, but actually people are turning up at church, with no previous connection with anybody in the church, saying, I want to find out more. And I think that's been replicated in lots of places now. That's not everywhere. So you may be serving in a church where that's not happening and you feel, what am I doing wrong? And I think, as we said before, it's not that you're doing anything wrong. It's just the Spirit blows where he wills. But across the nation as a whole, in general, that does seem to be what's happening. Churches are growing. People are seeing conversions. And sometimes from some very surprising places.
I was in London. It was great. There were about 250 people in St Helens there. There were another 200 or so around the country, maybe more than that, in kind of local groups gathering, watching online. Dave Jensen from Australia was kind of speaking. At one level, it was interesting because I think there was a bit of almost a slight difference in feel between some of what was being said and some of what I was hearing from the people I was speaking to. So Dave was really kind of looking on the Australian scene, commenting on how perhaps churches are not doing enough in evangelism. They're not seeing the fruit that they would long to be able to seek. And he was wanting to rightly address how can we become better and more effective in our evangelism. But actually, lots of the people I was speaking to are seeing growth in their local churches and conversions. And I think actually we are just in a moment in which it seems that there does seem to be a little bit more happening in terms of local church and fruitfulness from gospel kind of ministry. So I think it's absolutely right that we want to keep evangelism on the agenda. And I think it was helpful to be reminded that if we don't make that a priority and keep that a focus, it will just generally tend to slip in favour of serving Christians and becoming more insular and inward looking. That's absolutely right. But I do think there are lots of encouragements out there. And yes, we can do more, but I don't think we should lose sight of the way that God at the moment does seem to be at work. And lots of our churches are actively engaging with their communities and they are seeing people converted.
I think the other thing that I took away from the conference, which is very strong, was just how compelling the local gathered church is.
As an apologetic in and of itself.
Yes, I mean, apologetic is almost the wrong kind of word. It's a proclamation in some way. And it's not a proclamation of Christ, I realise that. But actually what the church does, and the church being the church, is itself a very powerful declaration. And Dave was very clear on that. So we need to have confidence in that. You know, sometimes when we're planning events, think, the next event, we're looking forward to Christmas, or we're thinking about what's going to happen in Easter. And obviously there's nothing wrong with that. But actually every week we've got an event on. It's the gathering of the local church. And Jamie Dunlop has written a book for 9 Marks or some years ago now called The Compelling Community, which I think is a great title. The community of Christ operating well, not perfectly, but operating well, is compelling. And we've seen that at our local church. We had 6 baptisms last week, which is just a great occasion. We've got about 60 members, and we've had 9 baptisms this year. So there's kind of that's the sort of thing we're talking about. We've sort of seen across churches. But in a number of those, people were saying the thing that really struck me was when I came into this church, I saw people. I saw how they were from different backgrounds and different ages, and how they loved singing together and how they looked after one another, and just that sense of community and welcome me in. And that really made a difference. That made me want to stay and want to find out more. And when you hear stories like that, you realise actually that the gathered people of God, it's not just a meeting. It is something more significant. There is something, it's sometimes difficult to articulate, but there's something supernatural that's going on when the gathered people of God get together, which is more than just Christ is present with them, though that itself is extraordinary. But it's the way that fleshes out and works out in the community life, I think is very powerful.
It's interesting. I mean, Dave was sort of talking about what it works in evangelism, what's essentially identified, I think, really basically 4 key things that are always present, which are the word, people, in other words, Christians engaging with non-Christians, time. It was really helpful talking about the length of time it often takes people with their engagement with the gospel to actually become Christians. And we mustn't think of it as being a 5 or 6 week course thing. It's often much longer than that. And prayer. And I think that's absolutely right. Those 5 things, those 4 things are absolutely crucial to evangelism. He was really encouraging churches to make use of evangelistic courses, that as people come in, you plug them into an evangelistic course in the church's life, where they get to meet people, where they get to ask questions, encounter the words. And he was thinking in terms of extending that over a longer period of time. And I think in a larger church, that becomes a really significant entry point. I think in some ways, in smaller churches, actually the church itself is operating like that as a community all the time. The history of courses is, I think, really interesting, that we invented courses, Alpha, Christianity Explored and others. I think they were invented because we were in a cultural moment in which people were put off church. that actually maybe they'd had a history of church had been boring, dull, liturgical. It was difficult to enter into it. And so we created the course as a place in which actually you did lots of the things that the early church did as church. They got together, they ate together, they shared with one another, they heard the word, they discussed. And the great strength of courses where they were kind of like church as it ought to be when church wasn't like that. But it seems to me that actually in a lot of our churches have included some of those elements of what courses were good at doing. And actually, therefore, the church as a whole is this compelling.
So having a meal
community
together, for example, as part of the Alpha.
Yeah. So the welcome in church, the talking to people afterwards, good refreshments, time together, engaging with one another is crucially important. And I think one of the things I walked away with was in our ordinary church life, making sure the gospel is central to our preaching, not just thinking in terms of feeding the Christians. We can tend to be complicated or deal with issues in their lives. Actually making sure the gospel is central to our regular kind of gatherings. Maybe some of our more discipleship teaching for Christians needs to come at other points in the week. So I thought it was really helpful.
And John, you were at a couple of smaller churches this past Sunday, churches that have been small but have seen growth. And this is another example of how the Lord's at work.
Yeah, two great churches. I was visiting a church called Wellington Chapel, which is in Herefordshire, and then a church called Bethesda Evangelical Church in Hay-on-Wye, both of which are small churches in relatively isolated rural communities, but both of which are growing. I think actually through the long-term commitment of pastors who love the people, who are preaching the word. They've actually both seen people coming in post-COVID, people looking for biblical
word, people,
ministry.
time and prayer.
Well, indeed.
Yes.
So in Wellington, actually the church has been revived over a sort of a period of about 20 years or so. They were only down to about 18 or so people. There are now about 70 or so people there. A new pastor called Christian who's been there for about 5 years. Who obviously loves the people and delighted to be able to serve there. Again, in Hay-on-Wye, Gordon, who's the pastor there, has been committed to that community for a number of years. Walking around the town, just people know him. He is kind of known within the community, and that's hugely important in that kind of context. So, it was a wonderful encouragement to me that God is at work. In these places that might not be particularly well known, that might be small, but where the word is preached and where people are loved, they're seeing gospel growth.
It's great. This podcast is called In the News when we do this, and the gospel is good news, and it's good to hear how it's going out in our churches, isn't it?
Can I share two other things from the Evangelism Conference that I was just really helped by?
John.
Something that Dave said I think is really important. He says, you don't just invite, you bring. I think that's actually hugely important to get into our culture, that actually we don't need to just invite people, whether to come to church or whether to come to a choice. We need to become bringers. And I think sometimes we feel this burden that we've got to be the people who do the work of evangelizing and preaching the gospel to people. Sometimes actually what we need to do is bring people to the place where they will sort of hear the gospel. So that was really encouraging. And I really appreciated Paul Levy, who preached at the Jeremy Marshall kind of lecture, which was sort of in the middle of the day. He was just reminding us that actually evangelism is ultimately all about the glory of God. That what to really ought to impel us in evangelism is the fact that God is not being glorified and honoured in the way that he is. And I think that rescues us from a kind of a pragmatism or a purely human focus. And that's just, I think, a really important perspective that we need to keep in our evangelism.
Fantastic. Well, what a great encouragement, brothers. That's super. Let me move on to a couple of stories that have been going around the news this week. Let's talk about jabs for jobs, as it was dubbed in some of the press earlier in the week. So this is about helping people who are morbidly obese to lose weight, to get them back into work, but not just that, to help people to have healthier lifestyles, that kind of thing. I heard a fascinating phone in earlier in the week where people were talking about this, shouldn't it all just be about diet and exercise, really? But could this wonder drug be a way in which people can lose weight quickly and helpfully? What did you make of this?
I think John should go first. He's the slim one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge story, isn't it? And actually, obesity is a obesity is a massive problem in our society.
Yeah, absolutely.
Causing huge health impact, impacting on people's lives, impacting on the economy, the NHS. So much of the problem in the healthcare system is because of lifestyle-orientated diseases. It's interesting, we are, in our culture, experiencing kind of health problems that are a result of excess and surplus. That is a problem across all sections of society, and it's been very, very difficult for people to address that. We know the health messaging. We know that overeating and eating kind of processed foods, fats, sugars, just is incredibly damaging to you. We know the answer is eat less, exercise more. But yet a very large number of people seem to find that very, very difficult to do for whatever reason. So this is a massive problem that seems intractable with very significant social costs. So the development of these drugs that enable people to be able to lose weight seem like a remarkable answer for this particular problem. That's why government is wanting to make it more available so that people can in a sense, lose weight, be healthier, be more productive. So I think at one level, this seems a sort of a great way of addressing a very significant problem. Obviously, the challenge is that it's costly. It costs money for the drugs to be available. There's the danger of people wanting these drugs because they want, not because they're really obese, but because they want a certain body image, and but people are buying privately for those reasons. But I think the idea of rolling this out widely on the NHS is addressing a very real sort of issue. I guess from a Christian perspective.
I was going to say, you wanted to bring it to a spiritual point, didn't you?
I do think actually here there are parallels with whole issues of sin and temptation and how we struggle against sin and temptation. At one level, one of the reasons for obesity is because people, even though they know the health dangers, are constantly bombarded with temptation, whether it be advertising, fast food, sort of supermarket aisles. And basically we're constantly being sort of presented with the temptation of unhealthy food that will bring an immediate hit of kind of satisfaction and instant happiness. And people find it incredibly hard to resist that. And at one level, the message of diet and exercise is essentially a form of works salvation, if I can put it that way. Just basically get the effort and the motivation to be able to do that. And actually, for very many people, they're simply not able to sustain that. And I guess that's true for us in our struggle against sin more generally. So in some ways, this a kind of idea of something that is able to empower you to be able to overcome this temptation, to not feel hungry in the way that you did, to be able to resist food, to be able to win that battle. In some ways, that's a parallel to the Christian life and the fact that through Jesus, what he's done for us, the gift of his Spirit, we are now empowered to be able to fight sin in a way that we weren't before the coming of the Holy Spirit and the gift is that's the great blessing of the new covenant.
So Ozempic, the Holy Spirit.
Well, sorry, I'm only joking. There is something here about actually human willpower not being able to deliver.
I think it's deeper than that even, John, because what's interesting about these family of drugs is that there's quite a lot of evidence that as soon as you come off them, you just put the weight back on. Which probably goes to show actually that they're a help when you have them, but if you don't have them, you can't. If you don't have the willpower, you don't have the willpower, and so I think maybe that's just reinforcing the parallel in some circumstances that actually what is really needed to lose weight is sort of a lifestyle change, a heart change. You can't just rely on something that's going to sort it out for you. There's no sort of silver bullet. But in kind of, if you just to develop that parallel, John, with the Holy Spirit, you cannot do this without the Holy Spirit's help. And maybe there is a parallel there. There is someone famous in the news, Phil, who's been using Ozempic.
What a segue. It's as if we plan it, Adrian, isn't it? It was fantastic. So one of the people who has used this weight loss drug is Robert Jenrick, who's one of the two candidates standing for the Conservative Party leadership. So let's move to talk a little bit about the leadership context there. So 6 became 4, has become 2, and it's Robert Jenrick or Kemi Badenoch who will be the next leader
a slimline
Conservative.
Robert Jenrick.
Yeah, because he's the one who's lost 4 stone, did we say? Yeah, absolutely. So
and he's been open about that. And
absolutely.
He's used Ozempic to do that.
So he's much less of a man, as it were, because of all.
He looks much younger. He now looks as though he's about 10 to me, but that may just be revealing my age.
But he does look good for it. Fair play, doesn't he? So absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the Tory leadership, not because we want to be political pundits about who should be the next Conservative leader, but there is something to say here about process, isn't there? There are parallels.
Well, even before that, I think it is important, whatever political party you come from, our political system depends on a strong and coherent opposition.
Who can hold the government to account.
Who can hold the government to account. So the way that our adversarial politics works, actually, it doesn't matter if you, or whoever you voted for really at the last election, you should be interested in who's going to be the next leader of the opposition, because that's what the Conservative Party members are voting for. So that in itself is a matter for prayer, whether that's your politics or not. But process, yes. Yeah. Well, it's been quite a long, drawn-out process, and we seem to have had quite a lot of these over the last few years. In fact, we've had 5 of them, have we? Or 4 of them?
I've lost count.
I can't keep track of how many leadership elections there have been. And in fairness, this process was clearly set out at the beginning. So in that sense, it was transparent. People knew how it was going to work. They knew that the 5 were going to be whittled down to 4. They knew that the 4 were going to make speeches at the Conservative Party conference. They knew then that the MPs were going to reduce the list down to 2. They knew then that the members were going to vote on them. And that's exactly what's happening. So in that sense, it's not been underhand or devious. That is the process. I think that there is a lot to learn from the process. It's very difficult, I think, to work through a beauty parade process,
which is what this is ultimately.
Been. And I think, that's been evident because one of the key candidates, James Cleverly, actually dropped out when people thought he would win, possibly because some of his supporters thought he would get through anyway, and so lent their votes. It's all very cloudy whether this happened or because it was a secret ballot, but lent their votes to someone else so he wouldn't have to be against Kemi Badenoch in the last round, because he thought he might lose that compared to fighting Robert Jenrick. So at that stage, it all becomes very political and very weird, and you end up getting actually not the result that people wanted. So transparency is good. That's a good thing, but also good simple processes. And we do see churches who make missteps in this area. I was in a church selecting a new pastor. We had 4 people come, and then we voted on the 4 people. Well, it was absurd. Each got 25%. What do you do with that? I mean, so there are clear missteps you can make, I think, in appointing a new pastor or a new member of staff, if you're voting on that will just not serve you in the long term, and actually will end up not bringing unity, which is what they desperately need and want in the Conservative Party, but disunity because it's not your preferred candidate.
Interesting. John, there is parallels, isn't there, for how you call a pastor and what are good ways of doing that and less good ways, I guess.
I think what are the criteria on which you're basically trying to choose someone? So I think you've got to be clear on what it is you're looking for in the first place. So one of the challenges here, I think, with the Conservative Party is actually very different platforms have been put forwards. What's the problem with the party? I mean, whoever leads the Conservatives after this process is, I think, going to face a very difficult challenge because they're trying to unite a coalition that's quite divided. So it's interesting that that they've chosen 2 people who are on essentially the right, who are sort of seeking to win back the Reform constituency. The challenge with that is you lose some of the people who are more on the centre, more on the left. That's the challenge of holding together any breadth of coalition. And at one level, there are issues of character, there are issues of what's your policy platform, there are issues of where do you stand and who do you identify with. And I think you've got to bear all of those things in mind for leading the group as a whole. And actually that's true in churches, isn't it? Actually, most of our churches, you can run church in one of 2 ways. You can run church in a very narrow way in which basically everybody thinks the same. They're in exactly the same place. You're in a particular place on the theological or political spectrum, and basically everybody comes to the church because it holds to exactly the views that they want. Or in most cases, this is true of churches and indeed wider evangelical organisations, you have to hold together a coalition of people, which means you have to understand the breadth of that coalition. Inevitably, you will not please everybody, but actually the drawing together of the whole is vitally important because it's together that you're able to do that. And I think for churches, they've got to be clear about where they are, what kind of congregation they want to be, what's the mission they want you to, who are you appealing to? So interestingly, in the Conservative Party, you've got multiple audiences they're thinking about. So the leadership candidates are appealing to the members of the party, who are generally more to the right than the voters for the party and certainly the general election. But in the end, they've got to present a case to the people as a whole in order to get people to vote them into office. At one level, in church life, do we serve just the members, or do we have to think about the community and the wider group of people we're seeking in the end to want to bring into church? So all of those factors, I think, are hugely significant in the process.
We watch with interest. Well, there is a new leader in another sphere we can talk about briefly finally, and that's the England men's football manager, Thomas Tuchel. The German manager used to manage Chelsea, I believe, be the third manager who isn't English to lead the men's team. I was astonished by this appointment earlier in the week for reasons I can explain. Adrian, your thoughts?
Must you?
Pardon?
Must you explain them?
Well, no. I can explain them if you like. But what do you think?
Well, I know you've got some very strong views about football. He's been a very successful manager. He hasn't stayed long in very many places, and he's actually got a short-term contract with the FA. But he has won trophies. He has got to finals, and he has won them. We've just left the era of I think the most successful England manager. People who were around in 1966 will say, "Hang on, what about 1966?" But Alf Ramsey was basically a one-hit wonder, and actually Gareth Southgate has had the longest sustained period of success for the England football team. I think it's a shame he's gone, actually. But the proof of the pudding with any manager actually in these circumstances is in the eating. So he does have a reputation for being a hard man, and that worries me slightly. But he also has worked with many of the players and got a lot out of them. So yeah, I'm a little bit more. Let's wait and see.
So my concern is it feels like England have changed the blueprint, and you outlined it there in your answer a little bit. So there's been these years of bringing on Gareth Southgate. He was the FA's man. He was leading the team in a particular way. He brought these like young boys through basically from the under-21s, then has managed them at senior level. And it feels like they've just changed the blueprint for a short-term hit to try and get over the line in the 2026 World Cup. Now, if that happens, the FA will be regarded as geniuses.
And they'll give him a knighthood.
Yeah, absolutely. But if that doesn't happen, I think we'll be back to square one. And I think he won't stay beyond the 2026 World Cup. And they'll probably appoint Lee Carsley anyway. And it was interesting because when Southgate left, I said, I think they'll appoint Carsley because the blueprint's the same. And that's actually the interesting thing, because if you think about how that relates to church life, you don't just rip up the blueprint, do you?
The difference, Phil, between you and I is this may reflect the sides that we support. I'm a football optimist. You, brother,
yes, I
you
cannot
can allow
be that.
me to
I
say
can't
it,
be that.
are a football pessimist.
Yeah.
So you generally tell me on Monday morning how badly your team played.
Welcome to my world.
Even when they win, you tell me what a terrible performance it was. Whereas I tell you how much I've been jumping up and down at my side's winning. And maybe it does need both of us to
balance it out.
Yeah. But yeah, there we are.
John, you've been very quiet on this one, brother.
Yeah, I'm sure he's got very strong opinions about the England cricket team.
I've got no idea about the particular manager and whether he'll be any good or not. I think it's really interesting that somebody has been appointed who's not English, and also particularly somebody who's German. So it's not the first time we've had a non-Englishman managing, but somebody who's come from a country that we've had
an Italian and a Swede. It's about time for a German.
An intense rivalry with,
yeah.
Lost on penalties to them on a number of occasions. So at one level, he seems to be coming from actually the opposition. And at one level, you might say, if he's the best man for the job, and he's gifted and he's right, isn't it glorious that somebody can be appointed even if they're from that sort of other sort of background, that hostility and that sort of record doesn't prevent them from being able to serve in that way. It's not unlike Saul becoming an apostle. You kind of think of all the people who you would not want to welcome. There he is, but he's kind of putting no. And actually, there's that question of what is going to be the reaction of the fans. Will they welcome him? Will there be a prejudice? Will there be a suspicion? Again, I want to come back to church leadership. Sometimes the people that we appoint might be the people who seem sort of from the outside, maybe even from a position that we deeply disagree with. They might come from an entirely different culture, an entirely different country. There's a national prejudice that might hold us back from appointing the people who would be best able to serve and best able to kind of take the team sort of forwards. So I think there's a sort of a lesson there of actually having a wider vision for who might be suitable to lead. As long as they are suitably gifted and as long as they have the right sensitivity and heart towards the team that they're leading. So again, the question has been raised, will he sing the national anthem? Well, of course, the current manager didn't sing the national anthem either. But that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily loyal
Good knowledge, John. Good knowledge.
To the team. So I think there's something about welcoming in those who seem to have been on the other side or are not like us, but yet actually might be the person.
Phil, other home nation football teams are available.
Oh, they are indeed.
It's not just England.
Josh Sheehan, man of the match for Wales earlier in the week, but we'll say no more about that. If you know, you know. Brothers, thank you so much for joining us on In the News. This has been Independence, the FIEC podcast. Hope this has been helpful to your work and ministry. Do rate and leave a review so others can find it, and we'll look forward to speaking to you again soon.